So in this final section of this lecture, we want to talk about school segregation in modern society in the United States today. And one way of doing that is to watch a video that came on John Oliver's HBO show that I have a link to on this slide that I would like you to take a look at as a way to think through some of the ideas of the role of school segregation in modern American society. And the observation of that video, as well as evidence that textbook is arguing that throughout the country, in many places, schools are as segregated now as they were in the 1970s. So that in terms of progress, that we often like to think that our political system, because of its democratic system, one that increases the access to more people to vote and all of these things, and that civil rights were bad in the 1950s, but they're better now. These may not hold true if you take a look at the evidence. And there's a number of pieces of evidence that suggest that schools today are as segregated as they were in the 1970s. And so I think watching that clip is worthwhile. It has lots of information that articulates in a funny way and then sometimes a darkly funny way about segregation and why it exists and how it exists. And a piece of information from that video that I think is quite important and interesting to recognize is that the integration that was put into place in the 1960s and then further in the 1970s. In the 1970s, they moved further to say that if you want to have truly integrated schools, the only way you can do that is to institute busing, mandatory busing, that you would take the reality that some individuals, some neighborhoods are predominantly African American and some neighbors are predominantly white. And so if you go to your local school, you're going to, by its very nature, go to racially homogenized place. You'd either go to an all-white school or an all-African-American school. And we're going to be talking about that in the next lecture in terms of how that occurred because of the system of redlining. And so this idea of segregated neighborhoods is one that it didn't just happen organically. It happened because of actions taken by the federal government and then the banks following this in terms of the process of redlining. But once you have segregated neighborhoods, as you do in many places across the United States, and certainly had in the 1960s, then if you just go to your local school, you end up with fairly segregated schools. And if in fact you need to have integrated schools, then you need to do more than simply say we're going to have them. You are in fact going to have to take some positive action. Affirmative action is the terminology. It doesn't mean that you like it. Some people argue it is because the government needs to take action. And so in the 1970s, they instituted mandatory busing as a way to achieve the integration that you'd need to make sure that you had a certain percentage of African Americans and whites in a particular school. And it was the imposition of quotas that particularly worried people because it seemed too artificial. It was also something that you would have people who were concerned that their children would no longer be able to go to the local school. And it was particularly concerned for white students and white families to go to the local school. And so some would be, it's fine to have busing of African Americans to go to other schools. Others argue it's not fine at all, but they would say, fine, if you're going to force it, that's okay. But to force white people to have to go across town in order to go to a school, it's hard for us to be involved in our children's lives. Their friends are going to be in a different place. We have to drive them all around, all of these concerns. And these aren't to dismiss these concerns. It's to point out the ways in which the individual liberties might actually be restricted if you turn around of a government policy like busing as a way to achieve integration, which might have an important goal, but it's asking individuals to sacrifice for those, and it's asking people of the majority population to sacrifice, and they weren't willing to do that and were very unhappy with it. But evidence suggests that that integration, despite people's concerns, actually worked. And that was that the scores, the test scores at the schools, both whites and blacks, at integrated schools were much higher. And so the gap in terms of the achievement gap, in terms of scores on standardized tests and things like that, did not hurt the white students in integrated schools. They stayed the same and moved up a little bit. But particularly African American scores went up considerably. And so it was effective. And so in many program was one that worked. The evidence suggests that it worked. But the problem is that, again, it was asking individuals who were afraid of this, who didn't want this, who were inconvenienced, particularly white individuals, from having their students bused, for having their local school taken away from them, and that important liberty to choose whichever school you send your was being restricted. And so it became a political issue. And finally, we see in this discussion of school segregation, if the segregation comes from other places, from where we choose to live, the solution is going to be one that is necessarily going to intervene in our lives in a significant way. And so again, the power of the government is going to have to be considerable, and the costs on we the people is going to be considerable as well. And you're talking about the idea of de jure and de facto. De jure is of law. And so Brown versus Board of Education and the actions taken by the executive branch and the legislative branch maybe led to, in the 1960s, we could say de jure segregation had ended. But in terms of de facto, of fact, on the ground, what reality is, in order to achieve that sort of desegregation, that integration, demands a significant amount of authority from the government, as well as buy-in from all members of society. And so you can see again why civil rights is such a difficult political issue for our system to deal with. And so it's worth thinking about that. And we're going to talk again about the role of redlining as a further way in which we see, if you are serious about dealing with the inequalities that exist in our system, it's going to take significant amount of government intervention, some people argue, because the inequalities are institutionalized. And so we have what is called institutional racism. It's not the idea of just hearts and minds that we saw in the Brown versus Board of Education rulings. It's not just about changing people's minds to make them less racist, to make them less ethnocentric and worried. It is also demanding larger changes to institutions in our society, our education system, for example, our housing system, where people live. All of those things then touch in our lives in ways that make us, particularly those in the majority, those who have a privileged position in the society, to be afraid because the status quo, which made them successful, is going to be changed. And they're not sure how that status quo change is going to influence them.